A shy young woman and a dark millionaire meet in a dangerous game of desire and control. She never imagined that her destiny would lead her to a man who would make her question everything. What started as a job soon transforms into something impossible to avoid. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end and you won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment saying where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Let's continue. Silence had always been Isabella Shaw's best friend. Ever since she was 8, when the world crashed down around her small head and the screams of twisted metal still echoed in her nightmares, she learned that words were dangerous. At the convent of the Sisters of Mercy in London, where she was taken in after the tragedy that claimed her parents, she discovered that silence protected. The nuns taught that desires were sins, that dreams were vanities, that a woman should be invisible to be virtuous. At 26, Isabella had become exactly that, a shadow. She walked the streets of Kensington, with her head down, her brown hair always tied in a tight bun, her simple, formless clothes hiding any trace of femininity. She worked as a cleaner in private homes, always punctual, always discreet, always silent. It had been this way for 10 years, ever since she left the convent. She cleaned, received her money, and returned to the small room she shared with 2 other young women in a cheap boarding house in Brixton. On that March morning, when the London heat already heralded another scorching summer, Isabella held a crumpled piece of paper on the bus with the address of the new house where she would be working, Eaton Square in the heart of Belgravia. She didn't even really know where it was, but the agency had assured her the pay was 3 times the usual rate. "It's a mansion," the agency owner had said, "belonging to Mr. Arthur Sinclair, a very important man, very private. You'll be perfect for him." The imposing black gate of the mansion made her stop on the pavement. It was like looking at a dark castle in the middle of the country's wealthiest city. The centuries-old trees formed a natural barrier between the property and the outside world, creating a bubble of silence that seemed to swallow even the noise of the heavy traffic on the nearby avenue. Isabella took a deep breath, smoothed down her brown skirt, and rang the bell. The man who opened the door was everything she hadn't expected. Tall, imposing, with black hair slightly greying at the temples and dark eyes that seemed to search her soul. Arthur Sinclair, at 42, carried a presence that filled all the space around him. He wore an impeccable suit even at home on a Tuesday morning, as if he were always ready for a business meeting or a gala dinner. "You must be Isabella," he said, and his voice had a deep timbre that made her stomach flutter strangely. "Come in," she murmured an almost inaudible, "Good morning, sir," and followed him through the mansion's corridors. Each step echoed on the cold marble, creating a melancholic symphony that seemed to tell stories of loneliness. The walls were adorned with old paintings, portraits of people Isabella imagined were ancestors, with serious faces and gazes eternally fixed on a distant past. The furniture was heavy, dark, expensive. Everything breathed money and tradition, but also a palpable sadness that clung to the skin like mist. "The house has 3 floors, Arthur explained as they walked. "On the ground floor are the living room, dining room, library and kitchen. On the first floor, the guest rooms and my office. On the second, the master suite." He stopped in front of a closed door and stared at it. "This room is not to be cleaned, ever." Isabella nodded without asking. She had learned at the convent that curiosity was a flaw that led to suffering. But there was something in the way he looked at that. Detentions, a mixture of anger and despair that made her wonder, for the first time in years, what might be hidden inside. The routine was quickly established. Isabella arrived at 7 in the morning and worked until 4 in the afternoon. She cleaned, organized, and prepared simple meals when necessary. Arthur was almost always in his office or had gone out for work commitments. She knew he owned one of the largest construction firms in the country, that he had multi-million-pound contracts with the government, and that his name frequently appeared in the financial papers. But to her, he was just another employer, distant, silent, and who paid her well to keep his house in order. In the first few weeks, they barely exchanged words beyond polite greetings. Isabella moved through the house like a ghost, efficient and almost invisible. It was exactly how she liked it. No complications, no involvement, no risks. But there were moments when she felt a heavy gaze on her, When she was crouched cleaning the floor or stretching to reach a high piece of furniture, she would turn and he would be there, standing in a doorway, watching her with an intensity that made her blush and immediately lower her eyes. "You're very quiet," he said one April afternoon, appearing in the kitchen as she was washing dishes. His voice behind her made her start, and a plate nearly slipped from her hands. "I'm sorry, sir," she murmured, not turning around. "Don't apologize, it's a rare quality." He moved closer until he was beside the sink, leaning his hip against the granite countertop. "Most people are afraid of silence." Isabella continued washing the dishes, but she could feel the warmth emanating from his body, the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with something purely masculine that made her breathe faster. "Silence is safe," she said, surprised to have spoken without being asked. "Safe for whom?" She finally looked at him and immediately regretted it. His eyes were even more intense up close, almost predatory. "For everyone," she replied, her voice nearly a whisper. Arthur smiled, but there was no joy in the gesture. "You're wrong. Silence is a coward. It hides the truth, protects the guilty, and punishes the innocent." He took another step closer. "What are you hiding, Isabella?" Her heart raced. No one had ever looked at her like that, as if they could see through the layers of protection she had built around herself over the years. "Nothing, sir. I have nothing to hide. Everyone does." He reached out and lightly touched her wrist, where her skin was wet from the sink water. The touch was quick, almost accidental, but Isabella felt an electric current shoot up her arm. "Especially the quiet ones." She pulled her hand away, her face red with embarrassment. "Excuse me, I need to finish here." Arthur stepped back, but not before leaving a silent promise in the air that this would not be the last time he touched her. That night, in her small, stuffy room at the boarding house, Isabella couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his dark eyes, felt his touch on her wrist again. It was a completely new and terrifying sensation. At the convent, the sisters always spoke of temptations, of how the devil used desire to corrupt innocent souls. Was that what was happening to her? The next morning she arrived at the mansion, determined to keep even more distance. But Arthur seemed to have other plans. He appeared in every room she was cleaning, always with some excuse. He needed to get a book, make a call, check on something. But Isabella felt his eyes on her, studying her every move, every reaction. "Did you grow up in London?" he asked one afternoon, appearing in the library as she was organizing the books. "Yes, sir." She didn't turn, concentrating on perfectly aligning the volumes on the shelf. "Big family?" "I don't have a family." The answer came out more curtly than she intended. There was a long silence, and she thought he had left. But when she finally turned, he was closer, studying her face with an attention that made her nervous. "Orphanage?" "A convent." She moved away from him, pretending she needed to organize another section of the library. "Ah." His voice carried a tone of understanding that irritated her. "That explains a lot." "Explains what?" "Why you're afraid of me." Isabella stopped what she was doing and faced him. "I'm not afraid of you, sir." "Yes, you are." He approached again, slowly, like a predator stalking its prey. "You're afraid of what I represent, of what I might awaken in you." "You don't awaken anything in me," she lied, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Arthur smiled, and this time there was something dangerous in the gesture. "Liar." Before she could respond, he turned and left the library, leaving her alone with his scent in the air and the feeling that something fundamental had changed between them. That afternoon, Isabella couldn't concentrate on her work. She knocked over a crystal vase in the living room, thankfully it didn't break, and burned the dinner she was preparing. By the time she was ready to leave, she was emotionally exhausted, as if she had run a marathon. She was leaving through the back door when she heard his voice. "Isabella." She stopped without turning. "Tomorrow you can start an hour later. I have an early meeting and I prefer privacy." "Yes, sir." "And Isabella." She finally turned. "Stop calling me sir. My name is Arthur." The smile that accompanied those words made something melt inside her chest, something that had been frozen for years. And it was in that moment that Isabella realized she was in danger. Not the kind of physical danger the sisters had always warned her about with men, but something much more subtle and potentially devastating. The danger of wanting something she should never want. The following week, the dynamic between them changed completely. Arthur no longer hid behind excuses to be near her. He would appear in the kitchen during breakfast, sit at the table while she cleaned, and ask personal questions with a naturalness that left her disconcerted. And Isabella, to her horror, began to answer. She told him about her years in the convent, about learning to cook from Sister Benedicta, about her fear of heights that made her avoid cleaning the second-floor windows. Small things, fragments of a life she had always kept secret. But for Arthur, each revelation seemed to hold immense value. He listened with an attentiveness she had never received from anyone, as if her words were precious. "Why did you never leave London?" he asked one Friday morning, as he drank coffee at the kitchen island. Isabella was preparing fruit for lunch, her hands busy peeling an apple in a perfect spiral. "Where would I go? Anywhere. The world is a big place. The world is dangerous." The answer came automatically, a lesson learned in the austere rooms of the convent. "Not all danger is bad," he said, his voice low and laden with a meaning she didn't want to comprehend. She glanced at him over her shoulder and found his eyes fixed on her, intense as always, but now there was something else, a hunger that made her swallow hard. "Some dangerous things," he continued, getting up from the stool and walking to stand behind her, "are exactly what we need to feel alive." Isabella could feel the heat of his body at her back, so close that if she leaned back just a few inches, she would be resting against his broad, solid chest. The knife trembled in her hand and the apple nearly slipped. "I feel alive," she whispered, lying to herself. "No, you don't." His voice was a hoarse murmur near her ear. "You exist, but you don't live. There's a difference." He moved away before she could respond, but his masculine scent lingered in the air, a tangible reminder that for a moment, just a moment, she had wanted to turn and lose herself in those strong arms. It was that night that Isabella committed her first conscious act of rebellion in years. Instead of going straight back to the boarding house, she walked through the streets of Belgravia, watching the lit-up mansions, the families dining in elegant dining rooms, the lives that seemed to exist in a completely different world from hers. And she thought of Arthur, not as an employer, but as a man. She thought about how his eyes followed her, how his voice changed tone when he spoke to her, how the simple act of being in the same room as him made her skin tingle in a way she didn't understand. It was wrong, she knew it. It was exactly the kind of temptation the sisters had always warned her to avoid. But for the first time in her life, Isabella wondered if maybe the sisters were wrong about some things. Maybe there was something between sin and virtue, something worth exploring. When she finally arrived at the boarding house, she had already made a decision that both terrified and thrilled her. The next day she wouldn't run from Arthur's gazes. She wouldn't hide behind silence and submission. She would find out what was in those dark eyes that made her feel so alive and so scared at the same time. Because for the first time in 18 years, Isabella Shaw wanted something just for herself. And that something had a first name, a last name, and a dangerous smile that promised things she didn't even know existed. Saturday arrived laden with rain and an electricity in the air that didn't just come from the dark clouds over London. Isabella woke before her alarm, her heart racing with an anxiety she couldn't explain. The decision from the night before still echoed in her mind. No more hiding, no more running from whatever was happening between her and Arthur. She chose her clothes with more care than usual. Still simple, still modest, but she left her hair down for the first time since she started working at the mansion. The reflection in the boarding house mirror surprised her. There was a woman there she didn't fully recognize, a woman with bright eyes and a less resigned expression. The mansion was bathed in a welcoming dimness when she arrived. Arthur was in the library, sitting in an aged leather armchair reading a financial newspaper. He was wearing casual clothes, dark jeans and a white cotton shirt that highlighted the breadth of his shoulders. When she entered to greet him, he looked up and completely stopped what he was doing. "Your hair is different," he said, his voice laden with something she couldn't identify. "I forgot to tie it up," she lied, feeling her face grow warm. Arthur slowly folded the newspaper, his eyes never leaving her. "It looks beautiful like that." It was a simple compliment, but the way he looked at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time, made something stir deep in her stomach. "Thank you," she murmured, and quickly left before he could say anything else. But throughout the morning, she felt his eyes on her. When she was cleaning the living room, he would appear to look for a book. When she was organizing the kitchen, he would come down to get some water, always with plausible excuses, always maintaining a respectful distance, but always there, a constant presence that made her hyper-aware of her every move. "Are you afraid of the rain?" he asked in the middle of the afternoon, when the thunder began to echo louder and she involuntarily flinched near the dining room window. "Not exactly afraid," she said, wiping the mahogany table with nervous movements. "I just don't like loud noises." "Because of your parents' accident?" The question caught her by surprise. She had never mentioned how her parents died, only that she had been an orphan since childhood. "How do you know?" "Arthur," he corrected gently, "and I do research on the people who work in my house. It's a matter of security." Isabella stopped cleaning and faced him. "What else did you find out about me?" "That you were an exemplary student at the convent, that the sisters considered you a potential religious vocation, that you refused 3 offers to continue your studies." He came closer, walking around the table until he was beside her. "That you've never had a boyfriend, never been seen at parties, never done anything a young woman your age would normally do." Embarrassment mixed with anger made her chest tighten. "And what does that matter to you, sir?" "To me, as an employer, nothing." He stopped right in front of her, so close she could count the small wrinkles around his dark eyes. "To me as a man, everything." The air between them became charged with a tension Isabella could almost touch. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do." His voice was low, intimate. "You're just afraid to admit it." Before she could answer, a particularly loud clap of thunder echoed through the house, and she flinched instinctively. Without thinking, Arthur reached out and touched her arm, a gesture of comfort that turned into something much more complex when she didn't pull away. "It's all right," he whispered. "It's just noise." But it wasn't just noise. It was the past returning in waves. It was the fear she had carried since she was 8. It was the feeling of always being on the verge of losing something important. And maybe it was also the fear of the present, of what was happening there in that dark room, with the rain beating against the windows and a dangerous man offering consolation. "When my parents died," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "it was on a stormy night. The car skidded on the wet road and—" She couldn't finish. Arthur's hand moved from her arm to her face, his long fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that made her close her eyes. "You don't have to carry this alone forever." "Yes, I do. It's all I have." "No, it's not." He leaned in, his face so close she could feel his breath against her skin. "You have so much more than you imagine." For an infinite moment, Isabella thought he was going to kiss her. Every fiber of her being was prepared for it, wanting and fearing it at the same time. But instead, he pulled back, leaving her with her skin still tingling where he had touched. "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I shouldn't have. That was inappropriate." "Was it?" she asked, surprising herself with her own courage. Arthur looked at her with an intensity that made her feel naked. "You know it was." "I know what people would say it was. I don't know if I agree with them." It was the boldest statement she had ever made in her life, and the slow smile that spread across Arthur's face was both a reward and a promise. "You're dangerous, Isabella Shaw," he said, "much more dangerous than you imagine." That evening the rain continued, and Isabella stayed late, organizing the books in the library that Arthur had left scattered. He was in his office on the phone. She could hear his deep voice echoing down the hall, discussing contracts and deadlines. It was his world, a world of money and power she only knew from a distance. When she finally finished in the library, it was past 8 o'clock. The rain had subsided to a fine drizzle, and the house was plunged into a quiet that seemed to amplify every sound: her footsteps on the marble, the ticking of the antique clock in the hall, The distant murmurs of Arthur's phone conversation. She was putting the cleaning supplies away in the kitchen cupboard when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find Arthur standing in the doorway, still wearing the white shirt but with the sleeves rolled up, and the top buttons undone. There was something different in his expression, a tension she hadn't seen before. "Still here?" he asked. "I just finished. Sorry for staying so late." "Don't be sorry." He entered the kitchen and went to the refrigerator, taking out a bottle of water. His hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly. "Want some?" "Thank you." He poured 2 glasses and handed one to her, their fingers briefly touching during the exchange. "Do you know the history of this house?" he asked suddenly. "No, sir, Arthur. It was built in the 1940s by a coffee baron. He lived here with his wife and 3 children. Arthur took a sip of water, his eyes lost on some distant point. "They all died of yellow fever in a single winter. He never recovered, became a recluse. They say he haunted the halls every night, searching for them." "Is that why the house feels so sad?" Isabella asked. Arthur smiled, but there was no joy in the gesture. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's because houses absorb the emotions of those who live in them, and I'm not exactly a cheerful person." "Why not?" The question slipped out before she could censor herself. Arthur looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Because I've learned that the things we desire most are the ones we most easily lose." "What did you lose?" "Arthur," he corrected again, but this time his voice was weary. "And it's not what I lost. It's what I did to get what I thought I wanted." There was a deep pain in those words, a guilt that Isabella could feel emanating from him like heat. "We all make mistakes. Some mistakes are unforgivable." He finished his water and placed the glass in the sink. "Some mistakes turn us into people we no longer recognize." "And what was the person you were before like?" Arthur turned to her, and there was something wild in his eyes. He was an arrogant young man who thought he could have everything, that he deserved everything, that the rules applied to others, not to him. "And now? Now I know I deserve nothing, especially not the good things." Isabella moved closer to him, driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand. "Everyone deserves good things." "Do you really believe that?" "I do. Even knowing that I'm a dangerous man, that I have secrets that could destroy your faith in humanity?" His response should have frightened her, but instead she felt even more drawn to the raw vulnerability he was revealing. "Everyone has secrets. Mine are different." He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "They're the kind of secrets that hurt innocent people. I'm not as innocent as you think." "Yes, you are." He raised his hand and touched her face again, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. "You're the most innocent woman I've ever met, and I will destroy that innocence if you let me." "And what if I want you to destroy it?" The words came out in a whisper, but their impact was like a scream. Arthur closed his eyes, his breathing becoming heavy. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." She placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beat rapidly beneath his shirt. "I know exactly what I'm saying." For a moment they stood like that, her with her hand on his chest, him with his fingers tracing her face. The tension between them was almost unbearable, a thread stretched to its breaking point. Then Arthur pulled away, breathing heavily. "You should go home." "I don't want to go." "Isabella." His voice was both a warning and a plea. "I don't want to go," she repeated more firmly. "Not today. Not after what just happened here." "Nothing happened here." "Liar." It was the second time she had called him that, and this time there was a new courage in her voice. "Something has been happening between us since the first day. You know it, and I know it too." Arthur stared at her for a long moment, a silent war raging behind his dark eyes. "You have no idea where this could lead? Then show me." It was a statement so simple and yet so laden with meaning that the air in the kitchen seemed to thicken. Arthur approached again, but this time there was something predatory in his movements, something that should have scared Isabella but instead made her pulse quicken. "If I show you," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "there's no going back. Do you understand that?" "I understand." "No, you don't." He leaned in until his lips were almost touching her ear. "Because when I show you who I really am, what I really want to do with you, you'll discover that the sweet, innocent woman the sisters raised no longer exists. You'll discover there's a dark part inside you that matches mine perfectly." His whisper against her skin made Isabella tremble, but not with fear. It was something much more primitive, more basic. "You're trying to scare me. I'm trying to protect you. And what if I don't want protection?" Arthur pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "Then you're braver than I thought, or more foolish." "Maybe both." He smiled, and this time there was something genuinely warm in the gesture. "Definitely both." The front doorbell echoed through the house, shattering the moment like a stone thrown into a still pond. Arthur stiffened immediately, all the vulnerability he had shown vanishing behind a cold mask. "Wait here," he said, his voice reverting to the formal tone of an employer. Isabella watched him leave the kitchen, his muscles tense under his shirt. She could hear voices in the entrance hall, Arthur's and another man's, higher-pitched, anxious. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clearly confrontational. After a few minutes, Arthur returned to the kitchen, but it was as if he were a completely different person. The vulnerable man who had been there moments before had disappeared, replaced by the cold, distant businessman she knew from her first weeks of work. "You should go home now," he said, not looking at her directly. "What happened?" "Nothing that concerns you." The sudden coldness in his voice was like a slap in the face. Isabella felt herself blush with humiliation and anger. "Of course. I'm sorry for getting involved in matters that aren't my business." She headed to the cupboard to get her bag, but Arthur grabbed her by the arm. "That's not it. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." She pulled her arm free. "I understand that for a moment you forgot who I am, but don't worry. It won't happen again." "Isabella, wait!" But she was already out the back door, the fine rain wetting her face as she walked quickly through the garden to the gate. She didn't turn when she heard him call her name, didn't slow her pace when she heard his footsteps following her. Only when she was safe on the bus, watching the lights of the mansion disappear in the distance, did she allow herself to cry. Not from sadness, but from anger. Anger at herself for believing there could be something real between her and Arthur Sinclair. Anger at him for awakening hope she didn't even know she had. Anger at the world that always reminded her of her place. But more than anything, she was angry because a part of her, a part that was growing every day, still wanted to go back. Still wanted to find out what was behind those dark eyes. Still wanted to explore the darkness he had promised to show her. And that scared her more than anything he could have said. Isabella spent the entire Sunday at the boarding house, lying on her narrow bed, staring at the damp-stained ceiling and trying not to think about Arthur. It didn't work. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment in the kitchen, the vulnerability in his eyes, the promise in his voice, and then the sudden coldness when that mysterious visitor appeared. The other girls at the boarding house tried to include her in conversations about boyfriends and plans for the week, but Isabella could barely concentrate. How could she explain that she was obsessed with a man who was her boss, who represented everything the convent sisters had taught her to avoid, and who nonetheless made her feel more alive than she had ever felt? On Monday morning, she arrived at the mansion determined to maintain a professional distance. She wore her hair tied up again, chose her most formal clothes and arrived exactly on time, not a minute early or late. But her resolutions began to crumble the moment Arthur opened the door. He was visibly exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, a stubble on his chin, and he was wearing the same clothes, from Saturday, now wrinkled as if he had slept in them. When he saw her, something flickered across his face, relief perhaps, or gratitude. "I thought you wouldn't come back," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need the job," she replied coolly. "Is that all?" Isabella stared at him, fighting the urge to ask if he was okay, if he had slept, if he needed anything. What else would it be? Arthur studied her face for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her in. "Of course. Nothing else." Throughout the morning, they danced a strange waltz of proximity and distance. Isabella cleaned with military efficiency, focused on each task as if her life depended on it. Arthur appeared and disappeared from the rooms, always finding some reason to be in the same space as her, but without trying to talk. It was while she was cleaning the ground-floor guest bathroom that Isabella found the first clue as to what had so disturbed Arthur on Saturday. A piece of paper had fallen behind the toilet, a crumpled letter, as if thrown there in anger. She hesitated for a moment, knowing she shouldn't read it, but curiosity won. The letter was from a lawyer addressed to Arthur. The legal jargon was complicated, but the gist was clear. Someone was questioning the death of his ex-wife, Beatrice. There were mentions of new evidence, reopened investigation, and need for a statement. Isabella felt a chill in her stomach. A dead ex-wife. Arthur had mentioned a past marriage, but never specified what had happened. And now she was discovering there were legal issues involved. Found something interesting? His voice behind her made her jump, her heart pounding. She turned, still holding the letter, her face red with guilt. I'm sorry. I was cleaning behind the toilet, and this fell. Arthur approached slowly, holding out his hand. Give it to me. She handed him the letter, expecting anger, but his expression was just weary. Did you read it? Yes, she admitted. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No, you shouldn't have. He crumpled the letter again, the muscles in his jaw tight. But since you have, now we have a problem. What kind of problem? You know something about me that could be complicated. Arthur leaned against the doorframe, blocking her exit. The question is, what do I do about it? There was something in his voice that made Isabella instinctively back away. I won't tell anyone, it's none of my business. No, it's not. He took another step closer. But now you're curious, aren't you? You want to know what happened to Beatrice? No. You want to know if I killed her. The raw question left her breathless. Did you? Arthur smiled, but there was no humor in the gesture. That's the right question, isn't it? Straight to the point. He leaned in, his face close to hers. And what if I said yes? That I did something terrible to the woman I once loved? What would you do? Isabella studied him, looking for signs of lies or madness, but all she saw was a deep pain and an exhaustion that seemed to go bone deep. I'd say you're trying to scare me again. And you'd be right. He pulled away, running his hands through his hair. I didn't kill Beatrice, Isabella, but maybe it would have been more humane if I had. What do you mean by that? Arthur was silent for a long moment, looking out the small bathroom window at the garden outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with remorse. Beatrice was fragile, emotionally fragile. When we got married, I thought I could protect her, take care of her. But I was young, arrogant, obsessed with work. I left her alone too much, ignored the signs that she was getting worse. Worse how? Depression, anxiety, hallucinations. He turned to Isabella. She started to become convinced I was having an affair, that I wanted to get rid of her. Nothing I said could convince her otherwise. Were you having an affair? No. But I was having something worse. I was having success. Every new contract, every new deal closed was more important to me than the woman crying alone at home every night. Isabella felt something tighten in her chest. What happened to her? One night, she had a complete psychotic break. She attacked me with a kitchen knife, saying she was going to kill me before I killed her. I managed to disarm her, but... He paused, swallowing hard. She spent 3 months in a facility after that, and when she got out, she wasn't the same person. Where is she now? Dead. The word came out like a gunshot. Suicide 2 years ago, an overdose of tranquilizers. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Isabella could hear her own heart beating, could feel the weight of Arthur's pain filling the small space between them. And now someone is questioning the suicide, she said. Her brother. He always thought I manipulated her to death, and now he's hired a lawyer to try and prove it. Arthur laughed bitterly. The funny thing is, He's not entirely wrong. I may not have physically killed her, but I destroyed her mind as completely as if I had used a gun. Isabella moved closer to him, driven by an impulse to comfort him. You can't carry the blame for her mental illness. I can and I do. He looked at her with an intensity that made her step back. And that's why you should run from me, Isabella, because I destroy the things I touch, especially the good things. I'm not fragile like she was. No, you're not. His voice had changed, becoming lower, more dangerous. You're strong. Strong enough to resist me when I try to dominate you. Strong enough to provoke me when I try to push you away. And that makes me even more dangerous. Why? Because Beatrice obeyed me. She submitted. And in the end, that bored me as much as it destroyed her. He stepped closer again, his eyes fixed on hers. But you challenge me. You make me want to fight to win you over. And when I want something that badly, I usually destroy it in the process. Maybe you need someone who fights back. The words came out before she could think them, and their effect on Arthur was instantaneous. Something ignited in his eyes, something primitive and hungry that made the air thicken. Be careful what you offer, Isabella. What if I'm not offering? What if I'm promising? For a moment she thought he would grab her right there in the small claustrophobic bathroom. She could see the internal struggle in his eyes, desire battling against control. But then he pulled away, breathing heavily. Finish what you were doing here, he said, his voice tense. I need to make some calls. He left quickly, leaving Isabella alone with her heart pounding and a sense of emptiness where he had been, but also with a new and strange determination. She wasn't going to let him push her away so easily this time. The rest of the afternoon passed in constant tension. Arthur locked himself in his office on the phone with lawyers, from what Isabella could hear. His voice echoed through the corridors, sometimes furious, sometimes controlled, always charged with an authority that made it clear why he was one of London's most powerful businessmen. Isabella tried to focus on her work, but her eyes kept being drawn to the staircase leading to the second floor, specifically to the door Arthur had said should never be cleaned. Beatrice's room, she now realized, the place where a woman had slowly gone mad, where the ghosts of Arthur's destroyed marriage still lingered. When it was time to leave, Isabella hesitated. She could just walk out the back door as she always did, return to her small, safe life at the boarding house, and pretend the morning's conversation had never happened. Or she could do something she had never done in her life, fight for what she wanted. She went up the stairs to the first floor and knocked on the office door. Come in, Arthur's voice said. He was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, papers scattered around him, the phone propped on his shoulder. When he saw her, he said something quickly to the person on the other end of the line and hung up. Finished for the day? Yes. She approached the desk, her hands clasped in front of her. But I wanted to talk to you before I go. About us. Arthur leaned back in his chair, studying her. There is no us, Isabella. Yes, there is. You know there is. What I know is that you are an employee in my house, and I am a man with serious problems who shouldn't involve innocent people. Stop trying to protect me! The outburst was louder than she intended, surprising them both. Stop deciding for me what I can and can't handle. Arthur stood up slowly, circling the desk until he was in front of her. You think you want this now, but when you find out who I really am, then show me who you really are. She took a step forward, closing the space between them. Stop telling me how dangerous you are and prove it. Isabella. There was a warning in his voice. No. No more warnings, no more protection, no more treating me like I'm a child. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling his racing heart beneath his shirt. If you want to push me away, you're going to have to do better than telling me stories about how bad you are. For a moment, Arthur stood completely still, like a statue. Then, slowly, his hands came up to cover hers. You have no idea what you're asking for. Then teach me. It was the final push he needed. With a swift movement, he spun them both around, pressing her against the office wall. His hands tangled in her hair, undoing the careful bun, while his eyes studied her with an intensity that made her tremble. Last chance, he whispered against her lips. Last chance to walk out of here and keep your simple, safe life." "I don't want simple and safe," she whispered back. "I want you." The low groan that escaped his throat was the last of his resistance surrendering. When he finally kissed her, it was with a hunger Isabella didn't know existed in the world. It wasn't the soft, romantic kiss from the movies she sometimes watched in secret from the sisters. It was possessive, desperate, almost violent in its intensity. "And," she responded with equal fervor, surprising them both. His hands slid down the side of her body, exploring curves she had always hidden under loose clothing. When he pressed her harder against the wall, she felt exactly how much he desired her, and the discovery made her dizzy with power. "God, Isabella," he murmured against her neck, his voice hoarse. "What have you done to me?" But before she could answer, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house again. Arthur pulled away immediately, breathing heavily, his hair disheveled. "Damn it," he muttered, smoothing his shirt. "That must be the lawyer." Isabella tried to fix her own hair with trembling hands, still stunned by what had just happened. "I should go." "No." The word came out like a command. "Don't go. Wait here." "Arthur, please." He moved closer again, quickly touching her face. "Wait for me. We need to talk." She nodded, unable to form words. Arthur kissed her quickly one more time, then left the office, closing the door behind him. Isabella let herself slide down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, bringing her hands to her still swollen lips. Everything had changed. In a matter of minutes, her entire life had been turned upside down, and there was no going back. For the first time in 18 years, Isabella Shaw had chosen danger over safety, and she had discovered that danger tasted of dark promises and hands that knew exactly how to touch a woman. Now all that was left was to find out if she was strong enough to deal with the consequences of that choice. Isabella waited in the office for almost an hour, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. She could hear tense voices from downstairs, Arthur and at least 2 other men, their voices echoing through the hall in tones that alternated between formal and hostile. She tried not to listen, but some words reached her clearly. Evidence, investigation, suspicion. When she finally heard the front door close and footsteps coming up the stairs, her heart pounded. Arthur entered the office with a dark expression, loosening his tie as if it were strangling him. "Sorry," he said, not looking at her directly. "That took longer than I expected." "Is everything okay?" He laughed bitterly. "No, it's not. But it's nothing you need to worry about." He finally faced her, and there was something different in his eyes, a decision that made her nervous. "Actually, maybe it's best if you go home today. I have a lot to think about." It was exactly what she had feared, that he would use the interruption as an excuse to retreat again. "No." "Isabella." "I said no." She approached him, determined. "You asked me to wait. I waited. Now we're going to talk. It's not a good time. It's never going to be a good time." She stopped right in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "There will always be something, work, legal problems, ghosts from the past. If we wait for the perfect moment, it will never happen." Arthur studied her for a long moment. "Did you hear the conversation downstairs?" "A few words. Enough to know you're in trouble." "Big trouble." He went to the bar in the corner of the office and poured a generous measure of whiskey. "Beatrice's brother has hired a private investigator. They're questioning everything. The suicide, her time in the hospital, even our marriage." "And that's bad?" "It's bad because they're going to dig up things that should stay buried." He drank the whiskey in one go, wincing. "And because the more they investigate, the more they'll realize that maybe Richard is right about me. Richard is her brother. Yes, and he's always hated me, always thought I wasn't good enough for Beatrice, that I was a classless upstart who took advantage of her fragility." Arthur poured another drink. "The worst part is he wasn't entirely wrong." Isabella approached him, taking the glass from his hands before he could drink. "Tell me the whole truth. Not the edited version you told me this morning. The whole truth will make you run from me. Test me." Arthur stared at her for a long moment, then went to the window, looking out at the dark garden. I met Beatrice at a graduation party. She was beautiful, rich, innocent. The daughter of a traditional London family, everything an ambitious young man like me could want in a wife. Did you love her? I thought I did. Or maybe I loved the idea of her, what she represented. He turned to Isabella. She was the ticket into a world I always wanted to be a part of. The right families, the right clubs, the right connections. And her, did she love you? Obsessively, completely. In a way that should have scared me, but that pleased me at the time. Arthur laughed bitterly. I was young and arrogant enough to think I deserved that kind of adoration. Isabella moved closer, seeing the genuine pain in his eyes. What went wrong? Everything. In the first few years of our marriage, I was building the company, working 20-hour days, traveling constantly. I left Beatrice alone in this huge house, with nothing to do but wait for me to come home. She didn't work. Women from her family didn't work. It was a matter of status. He ran his hands through his hair. And I didn't want her to work because I liked the idea of having a wife dedicated solely to me. But you weren't solely dedicated to her. Exactly. And she started to realize that. She started questioning the trips, the late-night meetings, the calls I received at home. Arthur leaned against the desk as if for support. At first I found her jealousy flattering. Then it started to annoy me. What did you do? What any immature, selfish man would do. I started to lie. I made up meetings that didn't exist, trips I didn't need to take, just to have some space to breathe. He looked at her, and when she questioned me, I made her feel like she was crazy for being suspicious. Isabella felt a chill in her stomach. You were gaslighting her. I was, systematically, deliberately, because it was easier than admitting I had married for the wrong reasons, that I didn't love my wife the way she deserved to be loved. And she got sick because of that. The seeds of her mental illness were already there. Depression, anxiety, a tendency towards obsessive thoughts. But I watered them with my neglect and manipulation until they blossomed into something much darker. Arthur moved closer to her, his eyes full of remorse. Do you want to know the truth about the night she attacked me? About why she thought I wanted to kill her? Isabella nodded, though part of her didn't want to hear. Because a few days earlier, during one of our fights, I told her that sometimes I wished she would just disappear, that it would be easier if she didn't exist. The words came out in a pain-filled whisper. An already mentally fragile woman heard the man she loved say he wished she were dead, and I was surprised when she had a psychotic break. The silence that followed was thick. Isabella could feel his guilt filling the space between them like a physical presence. Arthur, now you see why Richard is right, why I'm responsible for her death, even if I didn't hold the pills in her hand. He moved closer to her, his eyes desperate. This is why I can't let you get involved with me. Because I do this, I destroy the people who depend on me. I'm not Beatrice. No, you're not. You're stronger, more independent. But that just means I'll try to destroy you in different ways. His hands came up to frame her face, and I couldn't bear to do to you what I did to her. Isabella covered his hands with hers. And what if I don't let you? How could you stop me? By fighting back, by questioning you when you try to manipulate me, by refusing to be your victim. She moved closer, until their bodies were almost touching. You said I'm different from her, so treat me differently. Isabella, you don't understand what you're asking. I understand perfectly. She rose on her toes, her lips almost touching his. I'm asking you to stop trying to protect me from yourself and let me make my own decisions. His resistance crumbled like ice in the sun. With a low groan, he pulled her against him, kissing her with a desperate hunger that spoke of years of loneliness and guilt. This time Isabella was prepared for the intensity, responding with equal fervor. His hands moved down her back, pulling her closer, as if he wanted to absorb her completely. When they finally broke apart for air, his eyes were dark with desire. If we do this, he said, his voice hoarse, it won't be gentle or romantic. Do you understand that? I don't want gentle or romantic, she replied, surprising them both with her honesty. I want real. I want you, exactly as you are. Something in Arthur's control snapped. He lifted her easily, setting her on the edge of the desk and positioning himself between her legs. His hands explored her body over her clothes, awakening sensations she never knew existed. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against her neck, his voice strained. "Last chance, Isabella, because if we continue, I'm going to possess you completely." "I don't want you to stop," she whispered, her nails digging into his shoulders through his shirt. "I want to be possessed." It was the permission he needed. With efficient movements, he began to unbutton her blouse, revealing pale skin that had never been touched by another man. When his hands found her breasts over her simple bra, she gasped, surprised by the intensity of the sensation. "You're perfect," he murmured, kissing a path down her throat. "So perfect it hurts to look at you." His hands were experienced, knowing exactly where to touch to, make her body writhe with pleasure. When he had finally undressed her completely, Isabella had a moment of self-consciousness, but the way he looked at her, with reverence and hunger at the same time, made her feel powerful instead of vulnerable. "My turn," she said boldly, starting to unbutton his shirt. Arthur stood still as she undressed him, his muscles tense under her inexperienced hands. When he was finally shirtless, Isabella could see the scars that marked his chest, some small, others more visible, all telling stories of a life she was just beginning to know. "Are you scared?" he asked, studying her face. "Terrified," she admitted, "but not of you, of how you make me feel." "And how do I make you feel?" "Alive," she whispered, "for the first time in my life, completely alive." It was then that he took her, right there on the office desk, in a union that was both tender and primal. There was pain. It was Isabella's first time, after all, but also a completeness she had never imagined possible. When they finally climaxed together, it was with an intensity that left her trembling in his arms. Afterward, they lay entwined in the silence of the office there, breathing slowly, returning to normal. Isabella could feel his heart beating against her chest, the rhythm still fast. "No regrets?" he asked, gently brushing a few strands of hair from her face. "None," she answered truthfully. "And you?" "How could I regret the most right thing I've done in my life?" It was a confession that made her smile, but it also brought a new worry. "And now? What happens now?" Arthur was silent for a long moment. "Now everything gets more complicated. I have an investigation into my dead wife, lawyers hounding me, and you." He touched her face. "So you've become the most precious thing I have, and that makes me more dangerous than ever." "Why?" "Because now I have something to lose." He helped her get dressed, his movements careful and gentle. And desperate men do desperate things. As they dressed, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably changed between them. It wasn't just the sex, though that had been a revelation in itself. It was the way he looked at her now, with a possessiveness that was both thrilling and slightly frightening. "I need to take you home," he said, checking his watch. "It's already dark. I can take the bus." "No." The firmness in his voice allowed no argument. "From now on, I don't want you walking alone at night." "Arthur, you're being overprotective." "It's not protection, it's possession," he corrected, pulling her in for another possessive kiss. "You're mine now, Isabella, and I protect what's mine." It should have bothered her, that definitive declaration. But as he led her to the car, his hand firm on her back, Isabella found she liked belonging to someone, especially to a man like Arthur, who looked at her as if she were the most valuable thing in the world. What she didn't know was that in the shadows of the garden, someone was watching, taking down license plates and snapping photos. The investigation into Beatrice had taken a new direction, and it now included a young, innocent cleaner who had become Arthur Sinclair's new obsession. And some obsessions, as Richard well knew, ended in tragedy. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of passion and paranoia. During the day, Isabella kept up appearances, cleaning the house with her usual efficiency, but at night she transformed into a completely different woman in Arthur's arms. He taught her things about her own body she had never imagined, awakening pleasures that left her dizzy and addicted to his touch. But there were shadows growing around them. Arthur received constant calls from lawyers. Strange men showed up at the door at odd hours, and she noticed he had hired security guards to patrol the property. When she asked about it, he would change the subject or distract her with kisses that made her forget all her questions. It was on a rainy Thursday that everything began to fall apart. Isabella was in the library organizing books that seemed to never stay in place, an excuse Arthur had invented to keep her close when he was working from home. When she heard loud voices coming from the entrance hall, one of the voices was unmistakably Arthur's, tense and controlled. The other belonged to a woman, high-pitched and furious. "You can't keep pretending nothing happened," the woman shouted. "Beatrice is dead, and you've already found a replacement." "Lower your voice, Carmen," Arthur replied, his voice dangerously low, "and take back what you just said." "Why, it's the truth. Richard told me about the girl. Young, innocent, an orphan, exactly the type that attracts predators like you." Isabella moved closer to the library door, her heart pounding. Through the crack she could see a middle-aged, elegantly dressed woman pointing an accusatory finger at Arthur. "Carmen, I don't know what garbage Richard is spreading, but—" "Garbage?" the woman, Carmen, interrupted. "He has photos, Arthur. Photos of you two arriving together last week, of her getting out of your car at hours no normal employee would." Isabella's blood ran cold. They were being watched. For how long? "This is none of your business," Arthur said, but there was a new tension in his voice. "Yes, it is. When—" "You're repeating the same pattern that destroyed my sister," Carmen exploded. "A young, vulnerable girl, isolated from the world, completely dependent on you. My God, Arthur, did you even try to change? Isabella is not Beatrice. No, she's worse. At least Beatrice had a family. She had a brother who cared about her. This girl has no one. She's perfect for your sick games." Isabella felt nausea rise in her throat. Was this how people saw her relationship with Arthur? As a repetition of the marriage that had destroyed Beatrice? "Enough," Arthur said, and there was a coldness in his voice Isabella had never heard before. "You've said your piece, now you can leave. I'm not leaving until you promise me you'll leave that girl alone." "I'm not promising you anything." "Then I'll tell her the truth. I'll tell her how you destroyed my sister, how—" The sound of a door slamming cut off the argument. Footsteps echoed through the hall, then up the stairs. Isabella quickly moved away from the door, pretending to be organizing books when Arthur appeared in the library doorway. His face was a mask of control, but she could see the storm behind his dark eyes. "You heard," he said. It wasn't a question. "I heard enough." Isabella placed the book she was holding back on the shelf without looking at him. "Are we being followed?" "Probably. For how long?" "I don't know." Arthur moved toward her, but Isabella took a step back. The rejection made him stop. "Isabella, is it true, what she said about Beatrice and me being similar?" Arthur was silent for a long time. Too long. "Answer me," she said, turning to face him. "There are superficial similarities," he admitted reluctantly. "You're both young, you were both financially dependent, you both isolated from the world and completely in love with you." "Isabella, that's not what—" "Isn't it?" She moved toward him, anger and pain shining in her eyes. "Then tell me, Arthur, how many young, vulnerable women have passed through this house before me? You're being ridiculous. Am I? Because suddenly it's all making sense. The way you watched me from the first day, how you knew exactly which buttons to push to make me fall for you." Her voice was rising, years of submission turning into fury. "I thought I was special, but I'm just the next in line, aren't I?" "No," his voice echoed through the library. "You're not like her. What I feel for you is not like what I felt for Beatrice. And what do you feel for me?" The question hung in the air between them. Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling with words that seemed stuck in his throat. "You can't even say it, can you?" Isabella said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Because to you, I'm just another obsession, another broken doll for you to fix and then destroy when you get tired of her. That's not true. Prove it." She planted herself in front of him, defiant. Prove that I'm different. Prove that you love me." The silence that followed was devastating. Arthur looked at her with an expression of agony, as if the words were physically painful to speak. I don't know how to love someone anymore without destroying them in the process," he said finally. "I don't know if what I feel for you is love or just another sick obsession." The raw honesty of the confession was like a punch to the gut. Isabella backed away, the tears now falling freely. "At least you're honest," she said, her voice breaking. "More honest than you were with Beatrice." "Isabella, wait." But she was already leaving the library, running through the mansion's corridors as if pursued by demons. She passed the room where she had fallen in love with him, the kitchen where he had first touched her, and ran up the stairs to the room that was never supposed to be cleaned. She stopped before the closed door, breathing heavily. This was where Beatrice had lived, had gone mad, had planned her death. This was where the woman who came before her had discovered that the man she loved was slowly destroying her. Without thinking, Isabella turned the doorknob. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. The room was exactly as Beatrice had left it 2 years ago. Clothes still hung in the wardrobe, beauty products on the dressing table, books piled on the bedside table. It was like a shrine to a dead woman, preserved by a man who felt too guilty to let go. But there was something else. On the walls, hundreds of photos were taped up, all of Arthur. Arthur in meetings, Arthur traveling, Arthur with other women at social events. In the center of the wall, written in red lipstick, was a single word: liar. Isabella walked over to the dressing table where she found an open diary. The pages were covered in Beatrice's delicate handwriting, but the words were disturbing. "He says he loves me, but his eyes are always looking for someone more interesting, someone younger, someone who isn't as broken as I am. Late again, smelling of a perfume that isn't his again. Why can't he just leave me? Why does he have to torture me like this? I think he wants me to die. It would be easier for him. A young widow gets more sympathy than a divorced man." Isabella closed the diary with trembling hands. It was like looking into a mirror of the future, her own insecurities, her own fears written by the hand of another woman who had loved the same man. "You shouldn't be in here." Arthur's voice behind her made her jump. He was standing in the doorway, his face pale, looking at her as if he were seeing a ghost. "Why do you keep this room like this?" she asked, turning to face him. "To remind me." "Of what?" "Of what happens when I allow myself to love someone." Isabella gestured to the photos on the wall, to the diary on the dressing table. "She was obsessed with you. Completely obsessed." "Yes." "And you liked it?" Arthur hesitated, then nodded slowly. "At first, yes. It was gratifying to be loved with such intensity. Until it became suffocating. Until I realized I had created a monster, that I had taken an already fragile woman and molded her into something that existed only to love me." He approached her slowly. "Beatrice no longer existed as an individual. She was just an extension of my wants and needs. And now you think you're doing the same thing to me?" "I'm afraid I am." His honesty was both devastating and liberating. Isabella looked around the room, at the remnants of a woman who had lost herself in her love for a dangerous man. "Then let's make sure that doesn't happen," she said, surprising them both. "How?" "First, you're going to treat me as an equal, not as a fragile doll that needs to be protected." She stepped toward him, determined. "Second, I'm not going to live in your shadow like Beatrice did. I'm going to keep working. I'm going to make my own life." "Isabella." "Third," she continued, placing a finger on his lips to silence him, "you're going to tell me everything about the investigation. I will not be kept in the dark about things that affect me. It's dangerous to involve you. I'm already involved. The moment we made love in that office, I became part of this mess." She held his face between her hands. "The question is, do you want me as a partner or as a victim?" Arthur looked at her for a long moment, something resolving in his eyes. "As a partner," he said finally. "Always as a partner." "Then close this room," she said, taking one last look at Beatrice's shrine. "Donate her clothes, put away her personal things, stop living in the past." Are you sure? I'm sure I can't compete with a dead woman, and I'm sure you can't fully love while you're still punishing yourself for her. It was a gentle but firm ultimatum. Arthur looked around the room, then back at Isabella. If I do this, he said, if I let Beatrice go, do you promise not to leave me? No matter what we uncover about the past, no matter how dark everything gets? I promise, she said without hesitation. But in return, you promise to stop trying to protect me from yourself. I promise. They kissed there in the middle of the haunted room, sealing a pact they both knew would be tested by the events to come. But for the first time since they met, Isabella felt like a true partner, not just another woman under the influence of Arthur Sinclair. What neither of them knew was that Carmen had returned and was now standing outside the mansion on the phone with Richard, reporting everything she had seen. She's in Beatrice's room with him, she whispered into the phone, exactly like you said would happen. He's doing the same thing to her that he did to your sister. Richard's voice on the other end of the line was filled with dark satisfaction. Perfect. Now we have everything we need to destroy him once and for all. The trap was closing around Arthur and Isabella, and they had no idea just how dangerous their situation had become. The bomb dropped on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the confrontation in Beatrice's room. Isabella arrived at the mansion to find Arthur on the phone with his lawyer, his face tense and his fists clenched. When he saw her, he hung up immediately. "We need to talk," he said, his voice controlled but filled with tension. They sat in the library, now redecorated without the somber traces of the past. Arthur had kept his promise. Beatrice's room had been cleared out and her things donated. It was a new beginning, but one that was now under threat. "Richard has filed a civil suit against me," Arthur said without preamble. "He's claiming I murdered Beatrice and that I'm now repeating the pattern with you." Isabella felt her blood run cold. "Does he have evidence?" "He has photos of us together. He has statements from people who swear they saw predatory behavior on my part. And he has Carmen's testimony, who is willing to say she saw you in a state of emotional distress." "That's ridiculous." "It is, but it's also dangerous." Arthur stood up, pacing nervously around the library. "He's gotten a court order. The police will want to question you about our relationship." "And what will I say?" "The truth." He stopped in front of her, his eyes intense. "That our relationship is consensual, that I never forced you into anything, that—" "Arthur!" Isabella stood up and took his hands. "Breathe. We'll face this together, remember?" But things quickly got worse. That same afternoon, reporters appeared at the mansion's gate. The words predator millionaire and new victim began to circulate on social media. Arthur's construction firm lost 2 major contracts in a matter of hours. Isabella watched the evening news at the boarding house, horrified to see her own photo on the screen. A blurry image of her getting out of Arthur's car. The news anchor spoke of patterns, of abusive behavior, and vulnerable young women. "Is that you?" one of the girls from the boarding house asked, pointing at the TV. Isabella didn't answer, but she knew her life at the boarding house was over. She could no longer hide behind anonymity. The next morning, she arrived at the mansion to find Arthur being taken away by the police for questioning. He saw her through the car window and silently mouthed, "I love you." It was the first time he had said those words, and she couldn't even respond. The following hours were a blur of lawyers, journalists, and tears. Arthur's lawyer instructed her not to speak to the press, but reporters hounded her everywhere. The story had gone viral, the powerful businessman and his young employee, dark echoes of a marriage that had ended in tragedy. It was Carmen who finally provided the key to total destruction. "She is exactly like my sister was," Carmen said in an exclusive TV interview. "Young, innocent, completely under his control. Beatrice thought she was in love too. She also believed he loved her. Look how that ended." Isabella watched the interview from the hospital where Arthur had been taken after suffering what doctors called an acute stress episode. Her heart broke seeing the man she loved being destroyed by guilt and public pressure. It was then that she made the bravest decision of her life. Against the lawyer's advice, against all her instincts for self-preservation, Isabella scheduled a live television interview. I want to tell my side of the story, she said to the camera, sitting in the studio with steady hands and a clear voice, because everything you've heard so far are lies. The host leaned in, clearly expecting a dramatic confession. Are you saying Arthur Sinclair didn't manipulate you? I'm saying I'm an adult woman capable of making my own decisions, Isabella replied firmly. I'm saying I fell in love with a good man who carries too much guilt for his past. But the similarities to Beatrice's case, Beatrice was a sick woman who needed professional help she never received. I am not Beatrice. Isabella leaned forward, her eyes shining with determination. I am a woman who chose to love a complicated man, knowing exactly who he is. You don't think you're being manipulated? On the contrary, Isabella interrupted. For the first time in my life, I am making real choices. Arthur never lied to me about who he was. He never pretended to be perfect. He told me about his mistakes, his flaws, his fears. That isn't manipulation. That's honesty. The host tried another angle. But the difference in age, in power. I grew up in a convent where I learned to recognize manipulation and abuse of power. What I have with Arthur is not that. Isabella looked directly into the camera, knowing he was watching from somewhere. It's love. Real, complicated, sometimes difficult, but real love. The interview had an immediate impact. Social media was divided between those who still believed she was a victim and those who began to question the official narrative. But more importantly, it gave Arthur's lawyers something to work with. Within a week, evidence began to surface that Richard had orchestrated the entire smear campaign. Leaked emails showed payments to Carmen in exchange for her testimony, contacts with journalists offering exclusive evidence, and even attempts to bribe employees at Arthur's company. The most dramatic twist came when the private investigator hired by Richard came forward himself with recordings of conversations where Richard admitted to creating evidence to destroy Arthur. I don't care if he killed my sister or not, Richard's voice said on the recording. I'm going to make sure he pays for making her suffer, and if I have to destroy a few innocent people in the process, so be it. With the evidence of the smear campaign, the case against Arthur quickly fell apart. Richard was arrested for fabricating evidence and extortion. Carmen, confronted with the recordings, admitted to inventing much of her testimony in exchange for money. But the damage was done. Arthur's company had lost contracts, his reputation was in tatters, and he had spent 2 weeks in the hospital dealing with what doctors called an emotional breakdown. Isabella visited him every day, facing curious and suspicious stares from the hospital staff. She didn't care. She had taken her stand publicly and wasn't going to back down now. You could have denied everything, Arthur said one afternoon, his voice still weak but his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. You could have said I forced you, that you were a victim. It would have been easier. Easier but a lie, Isabella replied, holding his hand, and I'm tired of living lies. I've destroyed your life. No, you gave me a life. She leaned in and kissed his forehead. Before you I just existed. Now I live. Do you still think you can love me? After all this? Especially after all this. Isabella smiled, and it was like the sun rising after a storm. Because now I know our love can survive anything. Arthur left the hospital a week later, thinner and grayer, but with a peace in his eyes that wasn't there before. The investigation into Beatrice's death was officially closed. The experts concluded it had been a suicide with no evidence of outside interference. What do we do now? Isabella asked as they drove back to the mansion. We start over, Arthur said simply. Together this time. The company took months to recover, but it did. Arthur implemented new policies, hired a psychologist to help employees deal with stress, and even established a mental health fund in Beatrice's name. Isabella went back to work at the mansion, but now as a partner, not an employee. She enrolled in night classes to finish her studies with Arthur's financial and emotional support. For the first time in her life, she had dreams of her own. She wanted to study psychology to help other people who had been through trauma. Are you sure you don't want a simpler life? Arthur asked one evening as they ate dinner in the dining room that no longer seemed so somber. A smaller house? A man with less baggage? Isabella laughed. the sound echoing off the walls that now breathed happiness. "Are you trying to get rid of me, Mr. Sinclair?" "Never. I just want to be sure you chose this out of love, not a lack of options." "I have all the options in the world," she said, getting up and going, to sit on his lap. "And I choose you. Every day I choose you." They were married on an autumn Saturday, in a small ceremony in the mansion's garden. Just a few close friends and the priest who had known Isabella at the convent. The sisters, to everyone's surprise, showed up to bless the union. "Are you happy?" Sister Benedicta asked before the ceremony. "More than I ever thought possible," Isabella answered honestly. "Does he treat you well?" "He treats me as an equal, as a partner, as someone he chooses to love every single day." The sister smiled. "Then, our prayers have been answered." During the ceremony, when Arthur said his vows, his voice broke slightly. "Isabella, you taught me that it's possible to love without destroying, to be loved without losing yourself. I promise to honor your strength, respect your independence, and love you not in spite of who you are, but exactly because of who you are." Isabella replied with tears in her eyes. "Arthur, you taught me that we deserve love, not despite our imperfections, but including them. I promise to be your partner in every storm, your equal in every moment, and your companion for all of life." 2 years later, as Isabella graduated with a degree in psychology, top of her class, and Arthur applauded proudly from the audience, she reflected on the journey that had brought them there. Had it been easy? No. Had it been worth it? Absolutely. They had learned that true love wasn't about protection or possession, but about mutual growth. It wasn't about being saved by someone, but about saving each other. And in the quiet nights, when they lay wrapped in each other's arms in the bed that had once known only loneliness, Isabella knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen danger over safety, passion over passivity, love over fear, and the man by her side, who had once been only shadows and power, was now light and partnership. Together, they had transformed a mansion haunted by ghosts of the past into a home filled with promises for the future. "No regrets?" Arthur asked one night, echoing the question he had asked the first time they made love. "None," Isabella replied, just as she had then. "And you?" "How could I regret?" he said, kissing her forehead. "The woman who taught me the difference between obsession and love?" And in the welcoming darkness of London, in a mansion that now housed laughter instead of tears, two souls who had found each other in the dark continued to create their own light day after day, choice after choice, love after love. Because some love stories don't begin with "once upon a time." They begin with "I choose you," and continue with that choice being made over and over again until it becomes as natural as breathing. And Isabella Shaw Sinclair, the woman who was once just a shadow, now knew that sometimes the best things in life are hidden in the darkest places, waiting for someone brave enough to look for them. And she had been brave enough, they both had.